Welcome to another episode of In Conversation With. Today we have the amazing Benjamin Kuffuor. I've been saying your name wrong for the longest time when we've been talking, so apologies for that. Thank you for coming down. I just really wanted to get you down because, well, I've seen your film, Claudia, amazing piece of work. And I really want to have a sort of a conversation with you about that process in terms of how you came to kind of create this idea and then your process of making it as well. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey as a filmmaker? Like, how did you get from this kind of seeding of you want to be a filmmaker to you now making Claudia?
God, it starts a really long time ago. So you're really starting about like 2011.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to the NFTS and that's where I studied. And essentially I went there on a screenwriting MA. And then after that, I worked in television for a bit and wrote some theatre stuff. But even while I was there, I'd always wanted to direct and just never had the kind of resource or the time or the space or whatever to kind of get that done. An opportunity arose with the school to essentially give me, I guess, some equipment as well as some crew to go and shoot something on a really low budget. And I was just like, well, it's a now or never type situation.
Yeah.
I really should kind of use this resource to do something. But there was a few caveats involved, which was kind of single location, 2 actors, which we kind of cheated around. And not much money, but all NFTS crew. And that's kind of how I was just like, do you know what, let me take this now. Let me get this done. And that was really the process of it's strangely quite practical. And for a while I had to find the story to meet the limitations of that.
Yeah.
And we only had like a 2-day shoot and we only had somewhere in the region of about, we spent about $2 grand on it, something along those lines. So yeah, it was really about calling in favors across the board, not just with crew, but also with performers and everything else.
Yeah.
It was a real slog, and then post was like an even grander thing, because like once you're done, you think you're done, well, you've shot, but then you have to convince everybody to kind of get this thing over the line, which just comes down to a feat of just sheer will, to be totally honest with you, when you're doing it at that kind of scale. But what I did like about it, for somebody who's been operating in the industry for a while, kind of going through the development process as a screenwriter and whatever else, is there was a kind of reclamation or a return back to an autonomy that perhaps hadn't been there for a really long time. Just simply because what happens is you get into this mode of people paying you for ideas that you develop and never really see into fruition. So it was nice to kind of go, okay, this thing is what we're doing. This is how much it costs. This is the time frame, and this is how we're going to do it. And so yeah, it was probably along the lines of how I'd been thinking for a while anyway. But I was always thinking about the importance now of having an outlet or a way to create things independently, away from the system, I guess, that is I'm existing at the same time. If that makes sense, because there's a kind of a creative, what do I want to say? A kind of creative fulfillment that you get from it in a way that sometimes you don't when you're getting 1,001 notes from different directions. So yeah.
No, I absolutely identified that, because I was saying as well, like my 9 to 5, I'm a producer, and you're producing other people's work and stuff like that, and it's not really authentically yours. And so, so I'm a filmmaker as well, so making your own work, there's a different feeling that brings. And like you're saying, that kind of autonomy that you have, actually, I actually can shape this whole thing from the creative all the way through to logistical side of things as well. It's quite an amazing thing. So are you saying Claudia's your quote unquote breakout short, or?
It's my first short.
It's your first short.
So I've only existed as a screenwriter up until that point.
Yeah.
So like I said, I trained for the MA in screenwriting. We did some directing stuff on the course, but that wasn't why we were there.
Yeah.
So in the 2 years, I really kind of honed, I guess, screenwriting that to a professional standard.
Yeah.
And then in the industry, I've been operating between the two, between kind of screenwriting and writing theatrically. So this is like the first time where I've been able to go, this is how I would like things to. And actually, to be totally honest, I think throughout the process, I was just like, but this is kind of what you've been doing anyway.
Yeah.
If anything, it's always been it never made sense that there was a barrier between me and the thing that I could see in my head. It just, it didn't, yeah. I think it depends on the type of author you are, to be fair. Like, I think some people, their thing is probably like, I don't know, like they're more easily, what do I want to say? It's easier for them to kind of exist in a space that is maybe not their own. I always kind of found it hard to an extent because I was always quite clear about what I was trying to say and what I was trying to do. So yeah, it's taken a long time to get to this place. But I think a lot of that was being satiated with writing theatrically as well and being a playwright, because it's a similar thing. You're almost like you're given that level of authorial, voice on it. So perhaps I was feeding that way. But the key thing was really money. That was really the barrier. It was the kind of the getting over the hurdle of cost and resource. That was really the only real obstacle. And finding a crew that you could, put together who had a similar shared view.
Understanding of real creative.
Precisely, yeah.
No, because I think that's so important in terms of like your creative circle that you surround yourself with, right? So you can surround yourself with some amazingly talented people, but if they don't understand your vision and what you're trying to achieve, it's kind of counterproductive. So to be able to find a team that actually gets what you're trying to do and can enhance it is a phenomenal task. It's a difficult one, but it's a phenomenal one once you get it, and it feels amazing once you do, because you spend so much time with them. So it's so important to find what I like to call your tribe. When you're doing that. So you would describe yourself, correct me if I'm wrong, as a writer first and then director afterwards, or how would you describe yourself now that you've made Claudia?
That's a good question. I think, I do you know what, like the writing part of it is the writing part of it, I would say, is the harder part of it. Because all of that is how that's kind of the orchestration, that's kind of the composition.
Yeah.
And then when you're on a set or whatever, all you're really doing is telling people how to play.
Yeah.
So the only thing I guess that would be harder for me, for somebody like me being on a set, is I'm naturally not a talker.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So like my natural instinct is to be within myself. And then on a set you have to answer questions and talk to people constantly. That's the game. But I think if you really want to do something and have it be exactly the way you intend, it's probably a hurdle that you need to get over. So I would still probably call myself a writer first, just because I don't know if I've done a sizable amount in order to reclaim that entirely. But I think I've kind of been doing both of them in tandem anyway, without really realizing it or having the opportunity to execute it.
But at what point, like how many times do you need to direct before you can call yourself a director? Because it's one of those sort of things, if you've done it, technically you're there.
Yeah.
And I think, like you said, it's like that barrier, like you was talking about, like what was stopping you from doing it prior. It's that mental barrier. It's like, I think it's more for your convincing yourself.
Honestly, I think
right?
it was money.
Okay,
Because actually, when I was in the school, I tried to do it then. I was just like, do you know what? I want to make a short over this period of time. I remember my story shooter saying to me with that particular time, he's just like, focus on your feature and your other project, because that's what the industry will look at when you come out.
Yeah.
So crack writing at full length. And he was right. Not because like I didn't get to flex that muscle or whatever, but because writing at full length and writing in a short way, they're completely different. Like the maths of it completely different. In a weird way, short films probably have slightly more to do with advertising than they even do with writing in a pure sense, if you know what I mean. So he was right in that regard, because actually that's a muscle that you need more in a professional context, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I didn't anticipate how long it would take to get back to this part, So yeah, it wasn't necessarily mental as much as it was financial. If I had the resource and or access to the resource to do it, I would have done it ages ago.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the time it is a bit of both, but it's actually good to hear that, because then it's like that's something you can overcome quite easily.
I guess.
Yeah.
For some.
Yeah, true. True. So that's very true. It's a constant battle to be
You're
fair.
talking about your pockets. You're like, that's something I can
my pocket. Oh, no.
That's big flexing right there.
Not
I respect it.
But you know what? There's different ways to skin a cat, as they say. So you've been writing. So you've been writing stuff for theatre. You've been writing stuff for screen as well. Why, with this opportunity, the story of Claudia?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm sure you had like loads of other scripts that you could have kind of molded to this or written something completely different. What was the draw to tell this story?
Okay, so like because of those caveats that I stated earlier, like with budget and resource and time, I needed to have something that worked in quite a short way, but didn't switch locations.
Yeah.
So that already is a handicap of sorts. And then I guess being a writer first, or training that, your natural instinct, or the most writers' natural instinct would have been to almost make a film that's like what we're doing now, which is Benjamin says something, and then Benjamin says something. It's ridiculous that we both have the same name, but whatever. but essentially, two people in a room talking.
Yeah.
And I was just like, well, there's no visual flair to that, and that doesn't really showcase anything that I deem to be cinematic in any sort of way. And so for me, I wanted to make sure that whatever I did, even though we had those restrictions, was reflective of a visual filmmaker or a keen visual sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was really a lot of the impetus behind shaping the story that way. I think as well, a lot of the stuff that I was working on at the time in theatre and stuff was quite political, like heavily so.
Cool.
So like I wrote this play about social housing and stuff like that, and all of that type of stuff, like not heavier stuff, but like it was weighted towards that. And so in this, it gave me the opportunity to tell a more intimate, personal story, but in a way that I felt that I still wanted it to be, well, how do I, like, not necessarily so literal, if that makes sense. Because I'm like a big advocate for kind of, I guess, Black esotericism, Black weird art, or like, do you mean something else other than what tends to be the norm or typifies the norm in mainstream? Anyway, so yeah, for me, I wanted to kind of give a sense of that type of version of my writing. And then also as well, it was coming from a really personal place. This was like a real person in my life who I was still trying to figure out. I was trying to figure that part out. I didn't understand all of what had happened with that, and thought that the film would help me get my way through that. I'm not entirely sure that it did, but it is really strange being on a film set and having to be reminded of all of that in real time do you know what I mean?
Like, reliving trauma. And then I did this.
And then in the edit, having to go all over it again and be in more pain. But yeah, so it was a kind of a confluence of all of that stuff, trying to tell that very real story, but in a maybe slightly more surreal way, and that I don't know is always the norm of kind of Black British art for whatever reason. So yeah.
Yeah, so I always find it really interesting when I see films like this, because there was that obviously that themes about romance, that sort of themes about loss in that kind of space as well. When I see stuff like that, because it's done quite well and quite intimately, it feels as if it's quite personal. So I was going to ask you that, like, what the inspiration was behind that. And well, you confirmed it's kind of inspired by personal experience.
Although it didn't play out like that, for obvious reasons.
That would be that would be a very interesting experience, definitely. Right. How important, even though I get it was kind of semi-autobiographical in a sense, how important was it to have Black leads for this for you? Or was that just, it didn't really matter?
Yeah, somebody asked me this question the other day as well, like a Q&A. Am I allowed to reference that? And I found it odd. Like I insofar as like how else would I have done it, if that makes sense? Like
that's a good question for you in terms of, because I'd say in terms of creatively, because I know, like, spoken to filmmakers and they have a certain kind of driver in terms of the stories they want to tell and the representation they want to put out. And some people, it's just, it's just a story that just happens to have Black leads. That's what I'm trying to think. Was that a conscious thought process in that kind of casting process, or was that, no, it was just like,
it's a harder question, because it's maybe my default position, if that makes sense. I think why I struggled with the question the first time the person asked it, and maybe why I'm struggling with it now, is it almost inherently within the question, it's kind of making it seem like something else is, I'm the other, and something else is the norm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like it's a stranger thing to get my head around, because my default position would be to represent what I am and where I'm from.
But it's one of those.
Do you know what I mean?
No, absolutely get what you mean. It's one of those things, though. I get what you're saying about being the other and it not being the norm. but we live in a society kind of where that is kind of, especially when it comes to filmmaking, it is seen as, oh, quite an exceptional thing. But the question isn't so much about it being an exceptional thing. It's like, oh, why didn't you have like white actors in that? It's like, how integral was that to that creative thinking? And so you're saying it's like your default when it comes to casting, I suppose it's who you are and representing that. So that makes absolute sense. But some people sometimes think, okay, so that character needs to be black, that character needs to be white, that character needs to be Asian. But
I mean, but that can happen too, depending on what you're writing about.
Yeah.
I think if I were, I don't know, even if I were telling a story about apple farming, the characters would be black first. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It doesn't really. It's my default because that's my entry into that, and I guess it. So I'm like, I don't understand colorblind casting as a concept. Like I don't get it. Just fundamentally because I don't understand a world in which that is true.
Yeah.
So as much as people are like, it doesn't break your understanding of what you're seeing in some realms. In some realms, for me, it does.
Yeah.
Maybe outside of like things like Shakespeare or whatever, that because they're already talking in verse anyway. But more times than not, I'm just like, without asking, without context, is impossible. I can't separate the two things. Similarly, if a woman's on stage, that means something very different to a man being on stage and whatever else. So I guess your question is a valid one. What I'm probably saying is it's so much of my default that I didn't even really give it that much thought.
Yeah.
I am a black man. This was a black woman. I will tell the story that way. I think why the question's interesting as well is that I think when you're writing about subject matter that is specifically, I don't know, it could be anything, kind of like a racial thing or yada yada, or something depicted in a certain place, that question doesn't get brought up. So if this was all just man them on the block, posting up, yada yada yada, no one would ask. But I think it's because of the world in which I created around it that it becomes a question, because I think people are kind of saying it could have been played by anyone, but I'm not entirely sure that that's true.
Because that's the thing. Because I think that's the question. Because it's not necessarily a quote unquote black story.
Is it not?
I think it's a relatable story.
Right.
I think it's done really well, and I think if it crosses over, I think it's done really well. I don't think it's specifically, and it's interpretation, so I could be wrong. I don't specifically think it's written for a black couple, but casting a black couple brings a different experience to what you're watching. If it was a Caucasian couple, it would be a different experience. Do you know what I mean? So that's why sometimes I think that there could be a sort of intentionality with that element of it. And if not,
there is, but I think insofar as like, maybe to me, a black story is broader than what it has been. That's what I think the difference is. So to me, a black story is as much Terrence Nance and Bill Gunn as much as it is, I don't know, Spike Lee. And do you know what I mean? Like it's broader than perhaps the remit that it's existed in. And I think that's probably more so the thing. Less so that it's not a black story, but actually it just, what we think of and when we think of that is, it's narrow.
That's the intentionality to actually show that. Because that's what I'm thinking, like, you know, when I'm saying like you want to, and I've said it as well, like a lot of the times the films that actually get the most shine on there are about black struggle and like showcasing the other side of all the sort of, you know, the different nuances of what it means to be black and that experience. A lot of that doesn't really get that shine because it doesn't fit a stereotype. So in terms of your casting for this, and again, this is me speculating, it sounds like there was at least a thought behind your head to show other sides of what that experience can be. So then it broadens that out. So then there's that intentionality in that casting. Because it could have been anybody. You could have done a sort of an Asian wife and a black husband, or, you know, you could have mixed up in any other way. But I feel from what I've seen of your work, that it was intentional in what your decision making and what you're doing.
But I don't know that. I don't know how much of a point there would be in that, if that makes sense. I don't know if. Yeah, I don't know what would be the purpose of me doing it only to have the same people in who are always in things. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
like so there's maybe that element. But I think as well, to your point about stereotype, and I don't even know that I enter so much in that. I can watch black gangland things as long as they're good.
Yeah.
I think the issue that I've always had with a lot of that stuff is it always sits on either side of the spectrum. So it's either kind of like that jolly thing of like people playing steel pans and like almost cartoony black,
Yeah.
or it's like extreme violent black, but very seldom is it human black. Do you know what I mean? It's that grayer part that's harder to get on the scale. So it's either kind of loud colors and people saying these people are safe, these are the blacks that you're okay with, or it's like street shit. And actually, like I think what's harder to get is just human stuff, in whatever form that looks like. That's the rarer thing, and particularly I think in the UK, a lot of the stuff seems to be broader in one way or another.
That's really cool. Now it's good to know in terms of how you think about that. So even taking it away from that element of stuff, but more to the technical side of stuff. One of the things that really stood out for me about your film was the grading, which I really enjoyed. And I thought it really brought this kind of otherworldly sense to it, even in terms of the colors. Like I remember it started off with a bit of oranges, and then it got a little bit more blue, and it kind of really kicked off, and then it kind of seeped back into that. What was the thinking behind that? Yeah,
so initially the steer was with the DP I was working with. I was quite early on. I was just like, we're making a black and white film in color. So I said, like, I want all of these classic textures that throw back to, I guess, noirish things or romantic things of like the 40s and 50s. And that's where I want us to hold. So visually, like in terms of what you're doing with the camera and the language of the movement of that needs to exist in that space. So it's going to be less movement, but more precision or more precise, like more intentional about how we're using the camera in the way. So loads of stuff on like Dana dollies and stuff like that. So that was our initial conversation. So when it came to the grade, because we weren't making a black and white film, I was just like, well, what it needs to feel like is how those films felt like when they first moved into color. And a lot of them were Technicolor, like really kind of, but essentially because we didn't have the resource to shoot in that kind of way overall, you could only push the color so far, but as much as we could push it is what I wanted. So it kind of had that like almost like Powell and Pressburger type thing, or a lot of the kind of the Hollywood stuff that existed when they moved from silent film into speaking, or from black and white into color. I wanted those types of textures. So a lot of the references were like The Apartment and a Satyajit Ray film called Charaluta and stuff like that. They were all shot in black and white, but essentially we were pushing what that would look like if that were processed through a color spectrum. So that was the thinking behind that.
It was really cool.
I'm glad you noticed that, actually, because like some of the time people don't pick up on the period elements. It's supposed to be anachronistic, like so to be two things, like I guess the future and the past working in tandem.
I think that works really well, like with the grading, but also even with the styling as well. It felt like that kind of era being brought into more of a modern era, and it was like kind of meshing together and kind of crashing, which then I think fed really well into this otherworldly kind of feel of what he was creating in that world. So I thought it was really clever because it was quite subtle, but it worked really well. It wasn't like, oh, it's trying to push it in your face. It was like, because for me, filmmaking is like layers, right? And I think you shouldn't have to, it should just, I know it's like, you know, background music. It shouldn't be in your face, but it should be there to enhance what you're watching. And I think that part I really enjoyed. That was like instantly I noticed. I was like, okay, cool.
Oh, cool.
This is actually working for me.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you.
So I really appreciate that, because sometimes I get bored when I watch them. So even those elements of grade and those little bits, it does enhance the whole experience.
Yeah, as well, I think there's another component, which is when you're making things on less money, you have to find other ways to eke out. Basically, you have to work harder to show yourself. If that makes sense. Without because I did want to cling on like a subtle texture and stuff like that, because I think some of the time with short films, because it's your instinct, or a lot of people's instincts, is to be very loud and just be like, hey, look at me, I can move the camera here and I can do 1,001 things. I can do all the tricks. And I was just like, okay, we're not making that type of film. However, we still need to leave with a sense of who and what I am, even though we have very little in resource, you know? So I'm glad that you picked up on something like that, because that's where I think we were, even how we were using Scorer as well. It was a similar type thing. It was just like, okay, there's a version of this that could just play out with the people talking in the room, but I can actually move the story just in the pictures, if you know what I mean. If we compose the story well enough, it can just, people can pick up the strands and whatever, and also it really tethers it to the period that I'm trying to play with, you know?
I thought it was done really well, because even I was about to, literally, the next question was about the score and how closely you worked with bringing that together. Was that original score? Wow. That budget as well. That's mad.
That was a lot of work. That was because when I was kind of writing it, I was hearing all the stuff. I was hearing the sound of it, so it was like really. In short films are the hardest thing to make slow, if you know what I mean, because they need people need to engage with it really really quick. So being slow is a huge risk, but for whatever reason the tempo I was hearing in my head was slower, and it was a lot of kind of like jazz stuff, so a lot of kind of like Art Blakey references and Miles Davis and Chet Baker, and then strangely the Arctic Monkeys last album, The Car, as well. Like I was listening to that a lot. That's very different to their previous. There's loads of kind of string arrangements and stuff like that. And so a lot of that texture and that pacing was informing how I wanted it to feel and how I wanted it to move. In the edit, some of the time we were too slow and we were too behind the beat. But I wanted to make sure that kind of the language, it's much to the point I was talking about with silent films earlier, that the sound of it, the musicality of it added to the texture of what you were seeing, you know? So it wasn't just what you were seeing, but also what you were hearing in a clearer and more direct way. Yeah.
It was really cool because I've recently had an experience of actually sitting on that process, and it's another level. It's like another level of filmmaking and understanding the nuance of it and it playing through. So it's actually added to it really well. And I know what you're talking about in terms of slowing it down. But I think you found the right balance of it, because watching it's like 13 minutes.
It's like 13, 14.
It didn't feel like that. It didn't feel like it was dragging at all, even though the music was actually quite slow.
We got lucky as well. Okay, so Alciona was somebody I was at the film school with back when. And I always remember her as being a jazz player and having, I guess, a different feel and different, a different texture. And this is actually, you made the point earlier about finding your tribe and stuff. Sometimes I feel like I was there too early. Because actually, there were certain people who I think were really interested in whatever, but their timing was just off. And then almost like conversation around film and whatever else have evolved. And then it almost like those people, do you know what I mean? Like they weren't served by their experience there fully. And Alciona I always felt was one of those people where, because of her being jazzy and whatever else, and not being kind of more in the stuffier classical realms of score, had been underused. And so when I asked her about it, I was just like, I have no money, I can't pay you, but I understand that you understand this genre. What do you have that's just sitting? And then I guess the music that's kind of the lead music of the film was just something she had written in lockdown, just out of boredom. And it changed the whole film, because initially there was more it was more dialogue in the beginning, but as soon as I heard her music, I bled all the sound out. So it wasn't even like a preempted thing. It was more so as soon as she forced me in another direction just based on what I heard, you know? And those happy accidents can happen when you're open, or when you're not, when your whole thing isn't about being in control, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Literally had a conversation earlier about that, about kind of ceding a bit of control, because then those amazing magic moments happen in those, because you can't plan for all of those things.
No, and also people have skill sets that you don't have. I can't play anything, you know what I mean? Or properly anyway. I can't sit there and tell you, like, I can't even use the language of it. So like sometimes it's the ability to listen is as important as do you know what I mean? The importance of speaking up, you know?
Like I embrace the whole thing of being the least talented person in the room.
See, I wouldn't all say all that for me, but like,
see, that's your flex.
Oh yeah, 1-1. Yeah.
That's really no, but it's the reason I say that is because I just love. Because the reason I bring people onto a project is because I respect their craft and what they're doing and what they're bringing to it. So then you've got to step back and allow them to do their work, right? If I could do what they've done, they wouldn't be there.
They wouldn't be here. Yeah.
So it's like that case of like, okay, if it comes to lighting and stuff like that, I go like, do you know, this is the kind of the vision. This is the overarching thing what I want. You're like, okay, I think I can do it, and then I'm going to be okay, cool.
Yeah, that was precisely how I did it. Like what do you call it? Toby's really talented, the DP I worked with, and I was just like, this is what I mean, and enhance it. Don't just follow what I mean. Find me like a pocket that I can't imagine and elevate what I'm saying, if you know what I mean. And you have free reign to do that. It doesn't really make sense to tell really good people how to do things.
Right.
They can only then think as far as you can think.
Exactly.
But if you let them, you free them up to do it, and you trust them, they show you something you could have never seen.
Exactly.
You know? Yeah.
No, 100% agree with that. So, I know this is your first short, but this isn't your first creative endeavor. What is your creative inspirations? What is that thing that you use as kind of, I don't know, touch points when you're thinking about your creativity? Like for me, like when I'm starting filmmaking, I remember I started in acting first, and I remember watching an old Denzel Washington film.
Yeah.
And that kind of really sparked something in me. And I just love the like Spike Lee films and all these different kind of blaxploitation films I used to see, and I love the color, the artistry, how they curated it, and the different kind of camera movements they used with it, right? So what is that for you? Like when you created your look and feel, because you're very confident, not in an arrogant way whatsoever. You know your creativity, you know the look and feel, and your film looks very intentional in terms of what you're trying to create. So then that to me speaks of a confident creative. So you understand what's in your head and how to put it out there. What are your kind of, I don't know, what's the word? What are your touch points when you're thinking about what makes your look and feel?
Everything. And I think that's I mean, kind of going to like a film school and whatever, you see a lot, and particularly at the age that I went, you see a lot very early. So you start imbibing, I guess, the language and texture and how many different ways to do it.
Yeah.
How many different, when I was there, I really made a point of not just, I mean, not that it was discouraged anyway, but like a lot of the Hollywood stuff wasn't necessarily on our list of things.
Yeah.
And I think, background speaking, because I grew up in an estate and whatever else, there was a lot of stuff that I hadn't been exposed to hitherto that point. So like I was picking up so many different ways of doing it, from everything from kind of French New Wave to what they were doing in the Czech Republic back when, during the time after the time revolution, to what they were doing in Africa. I did my dissertation on West African cinema, so like I was seeing Mambiti and Sembene and all of these people like at a really young age, and understanding the full scope and scale of what film could do and how it could operate. So a lot of it is just study, like the stuff that I picked up from study and the stuff that I've continued to do in study, even though I haven't been in school. Like I've always made a point of learning, right? Because you can never be full. But then there's another part of it, which is life. Like some of it doesn't necessarily come from art all of the time. Some of it is as much living as it is anything else. And I think when you're younger, you maybe don't realize that in quite the same way, because you're trying to pick up craft, and that is your obsession. And then sometimes you're most active when you're doing absolutely nothing, if you know what I mean. Like living life and being around people and listening to people's stories and absorbing. So it's all of that type of stuff. Music as well. Like I'm a big music head, and so because of that, I think tempo and stuff like that and listening widely plays into a lot of my art in a different kind of way. And it's probably why I like juxtaposition so much, because I like a broad spectrum of things. Like I can listen to D'Angelo in the same way that I listen to Radiohead, in the same way that I listen to Solange, and it's all the same to me. And so a lot of the time when I'm making stuff, I want it to feel like a confluence, or like an amalgam of all of the things that I like, which is why I think sometimes it's harder to go, oh, it's that thing,
But it makes for a really interesting creative, because it just means like, I don't know, you're playing, right? Because there's so many influences on how you can sort of like shape this story, this thing, and so many different inspirations that you're open to. So it actually makes it quite exciting to see your next piece of work.
I'm excited about that too. Yeah. I'm thinking, cause especially as well, because we should be playing with more money. So there's that. And yeah, it's just now I'm sure of myself in that setting, if that makes sense. I wouldn't, now walking on a set, I wouldn't think of myself as just like a writer. Who is like, do you mean who's cosplaying as a director? Like I'm
so it's two films until you can say you're a director.
Yeah, there you go. I think that's the number. So I'm like super excited about that, and also I think as the other thing that we touched on earlier, that thing about autonomy, that thing about there are still industry things that are in the fire, but always having a lane to make stuff for and by yourself. And I think for Black artists, maybe more than maybe other types, it's so important that you have a lane that is completely your own, because it's really hard to tell interesting and different Black stories with white money. That's just the reality of it. And invariably, no matter what version of it that you're doing, it's the person holding the purse strings is probably not culturally from where you're from. Which I think is why, like, sometimes when I'm black artists, a lot of talk about diaspora and kind of going back and telling stories through that way. But yeah, invariably, it's really, really hard to navigate that space of making something different, unique, and whatever else with your own people in it, and asking somebody who is not your, do you know what I mean, of your people to make it.
To fund it.
Because for what? Like, what incentivizes them to do?
There's no connection there.
No connection, but also the perception normally of whatever you're trying to interpret is quite narrow anyway. So it has to adhere to that in one form or another. You know? So yeah.
Cool. How many times have you screened Claudia, and what's been the kind of reception that you've had from it? I can imagine it would be different from audience to audience.
Yeah. How many times have you? Screened it into? It's been around, like, it's screened quite a lot internationally. I haven't been at every single one.
Cool.
But it's without calling any specific festivals out. Like, there's been some where it's been really fascinating, like watching, like, I guess a kind of all black audience who are quite vocal about how they react to the things. So there was that kind of experience where they were like very much like, why is he going to the door? Why is he doing that? Oh man, he's so dumb. Like, that type of shit. And like, I was just not anticipating that. So that was one realm of it. And then you have the other version of it, which is very chin strokey, kind of like the standard film festival audience who like laugh but kind of, you know, that type of thing. So it's been really interesting watching all of that. But I think there's something really good about that insofar as, like, as an artist, you start to learn rhythms of things. You learn the pulse of the people in the room are telling you where you've lulled, where you don't have their attention, where you do, where you could have been quicker in the edit, where you've missed them, what they don't understand, what they're already ahead of. You learn all of just through their body, if you know what I mean. Even if it's not, you know, their movement will tell you what you've done, in a sense. And then there's another version of it, is whether or not you're listening to them or not. Because sometimes there's one version of it, or most people's version would be like, yeah, well, the audience want you to be quicker, so you should be quicker. But then there's another version of it, which is like, they don't dictate necessarily the pace. If that makes sense. Not in a kind of like, I am right type thing, and I am the all-seeing, all-knowing oracle, but more so, one has to know what you're intending to do. So sometimes that isn't necessarily shaped by a response as much as it's shaped by your intention. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Otherwise, you're already thinking with them in mind, and that's no way to make anything. Because by and large, people don't know until they see it. So it's as much as about imbibing that, and at the same time rejecting some of it when it may not help the course of what you're attempting to do next. You know?
But it's filtering, isn't it? And I always think that going to actually watch your film being watched by other people is a huge and important part of your filmmaking progression and learning and shaping and evolving.
Amen, yeah.
But to your point, it shouldn't be completely dictated by people's responses. But I think it's a part of you trying to figure out who you are as a filmmaker and who your audience is. And then once you've captured your audience, then I think at that moment you can do what the hell you want to do, because then they trust you. If you know what I mean, they trust your storytelling. So then you can be as slow as you need to be. And there's that, and then they're like, you know, it's really slow, but I trust what's going to happen during this process. So it's a whole constant kind of journey, and sort of, I don't know, finding not only who your tribe is in terms of kind of filmmaking and actually making the product, but who's your tribe in terms of your audience.
Precisely, yeah.
Which is a whole nother minefield in itself.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I think in the one when the audience were really like vocal in reaction, it was a predominantly black audience, and when they were really like in full voice. What was good about that is there was an honesty and truth to it that is sometimes harder to find in that type of space, because people say a lot of things and not a lot of things. But actually, they were just watching it and like, whatever they thought or whatever they felt was it.
They was in the moment with it.
Yeah. And I was just like, oh, that's my feelings are hurt there, but like that's good. That's good that my feelings are hurt. And then the other thing about it is that my feelings are hurt there, but I don't care what they think. Do you know what I mean? There were two things like operating where it's just like, and then some people got in and some people, do you know what I mean? But it's like, yeah, I liked that people were negative openly and people were positive openly. in a way that I thought was true, as opposed to just industry speak.
Do you know what? I've always said this, and I live by it, is that as a filmmaker, it's our job to say something, right? And it's like, if people are reacting, whether it's negative or positively, it means you're saying something. The worst thing would be just to have that standard industry response of like, yeah. You want people to have that kind of investment in what you're doing, so they're like, I hated that, or that was amazing. You want that kind of authentic reaction to what you're portraying, because you spend so much time crafting this thing, putting it together. Only hours to put together 13 to 14 minutes worth of film. Like, for me, that's the payoff. So I would never, even if I had a film and people said, some really negative stuff, I'm glad because I made you feel something.
Yeah.
And I think that's the whole part of like filmmaking, storytelling, and creativity in general, whether it's art, whether it's music, whatever, feeling something. And if you can make people feel something, I feel that's the job.
Yeah.
Granted, you want us to match the intention.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess there's another more practical component about it. I think as like film and any kind of dramatic writing is one of the only art forms that doesn't exist until it's performed.
Yeah.
Like more time, if you're a musician, even if you're not, I don't know who's massive, even if you're not Beyonce Knowles, right? You can still kind of like play music and have that, you play the thing and you hear the thing. With our thing, you don't hear the thing until someone says the thing, or until someone shoots the thing. So in a very kind of practical way, the fact that it exists sometimes is a journey in and of its own, if that makes sense. And that is to be revered as much as, I guess, the response, particularly when you know what your restrictions are in terms of budget and time and whatever else. Not that it's whatever, but like it's just the fact that it exists sometimes is just more the thing. I mean, the fact that people can even react to something.
That's huge in itself, that you've actually been able to create this thing.
It's huge because it's not a given. Like, do you know what I mean? To kind of get X amount of people to work on your film, X amount of money, X amount of lighting, time, resource. Like, it's not a given at all.
No, it's true.
And we spend a lot of time in development and a lot of time and energy in scripts that you never see.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, the $1 million question, what's next?
Yeah. So there's like play stuff that I've had to do throughout the course of the year and have had to go back to, which I'm excited about for different reasons. I think as well, like to the point about why I think about independence, autonomy, and all that stuff. What I like about that world is you get to express some of that in terms of like writing something that is full length, that can say more things than perhaps you can do in screen professionally. We have television stuff in development, but television is in a tricky and precarious place at the minute. So I'm not hanging all of my hat on that, but I'm really proud of those projects too. It would just be harder to make them because of what is happening economically in these times. And then there's film stuff. We're in the early stages of developing a feature, but more than anything, I want to make another short. Not because of the kind of the thing you're asking me about, not being convinced of being a director or whatever. I think sometimes people jump steps too quickly. And they don't have to. And so I would really like us to shoot a short at the back end of next year. That's the target at the moment that we're working towards. If it's not next year, it'll be early in the year following. But that's more of just a logistical thing of like other commitments that I have professionally that I have to honor first, for monetary reasons and whatever contractual reasons. But as soon as those things die, I want to do something that is just us again. And the small team that I've built that I'm really excited with getting back in with, from like my DP, my editor, to various other people. So yeah.
It's really exciting because I really, really, really enjoyed watching your film.
Cheers, man.
I thought it was well crafted. I think, and even listening to like the little resources that you had, what you created seems even more impressive. So I'm looking forward to see what you make next.
Cheers,
Please do send it through because I'd love to see it. Because one of these great things with these conversations is I get to speak to people I really admire their work. You're one of those people.
Thank you.
So it's really great seeing you doing what you do, the focus and the drive that you have of it as well. And so I'm really excited to the next level that you take stuff to. And I really appreciate you coming down, spending some time.
Cheers, Benjamin. Thanks for your time. Thank you.
Cool. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Cheers, man. Thank you.
You too.